The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty shooting range in rural Montana, where the annual county marksmanship competition was about to begin. What started as a local tradition among hunters and sport shooters had grown into something of a regional spectacle, drawing participants from 3 neighboring states. The air was thick with anticipation, testosterone, and the lingering smell of gun oil and coffee from the registration tent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Among the sea of experienced marksmen, seasoned hunters, and competitive shooters, one participant stood out, not for her reputation or intimidating presence, but for the complete opposite reason. Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old librarian from the nearby town of Clearwater, had never fired a rifle in her life. She'd grown up in a household where books were more common than bullets, where intellectual discussions around the dinner table replaced talk of hunting seasons and ballistics. Sarah's presence at the competition wasn't by choice. It was the result of a bet gone wrong. 3 weeks earlier, during a particularly heated debate at Murphy's Tavern about gender roles in traditional activities, Sarah had found herself defending women's capabilities in what were considered men's domains. The conversation had started innocently enough, triggered by a news story about a female sharpshooter breaking records at a national competition. "Women just don't have the same natural ability with firearms," declared Buck Morrison, a local ranch hand known for his traditional views and his impressive trophy collection. "It's not sexist, it's just biology. Men have better hand-eye coordination, steadier nerves, better spatial awareness." Sarah, who had spent her evening quietly grading papers in the corner booth, couldn't let this slide. "That's complete nonsense, Buck. Skill isn't determined by gender, it's determined by practice, focus, and natural aptitude. Any woman could outshoot you if she put her mind to it." The tavern had gone quiet. Buck's friends exchanged amused glances, while Sarah's few supporters looked on with a mixture of pride and concern. They knew Sarah had never handled a firearm, but they also knew she had a stubborn streak that could move mountains. "Prove it," Buck had said, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "County competition is in 3 weeks. You enter, and if you can even hit the target consistently, I'll donate $500 to the library's new children's section." "And if I can't?" Sarah had asked, though she already knew she was walking into a trap. "You publicly admit that some activities are just better suited to men, and you buy drinks for everyone here tonight for the next month." The bet was sealed with handshakes and witnessed by half the town. Word spread quickly through Clearwater's tight-knit community. Some residents were excited to see their quiet librarian take on the good old boys network, while others worried she was setting herself up for public humiliation. Sarah had 3 weeks to transform from a complete novice into someone who could at least avoid embarrassing herself. She'd spent hours watching YouTube tutorials, reading about shooting techniques, and studying ballistics. She'd even convinced her Uncle Pete, a retired police officer, to give her basic safety training and let her fire a few practice rounds with his old service pistol. But pistol shooting and rifle marksmanship were entirely different beasts, and Sarah knew it. The competition would involve precision shooting at 100, 200, and 300 yards, distances that seemed impossible to someone who had struggled to hit a paper target at 25 feet. Now, standing at the registration table on competition morning, Sarah felt every eye on her. The other competitors, all men, ranging from college-aged farm boys to grizzled veterans with decades of experience, watched with varying degrees of amusement and curiosity. Some whispered among themselves, pointing in her direction and chuckling. "First time?" asked Jim Patterson as Sarah filled out her entry form with slightly trembling hands. "Is it that obvious?" she replied, attempting a grimace that felt more like a grimace. Jim, a kind-hearted man in his 60s, who had been running this competition for over 20 years, leaned closer. "Listen, miss, this isn't like the movies. These boys have been shooting since they could hold a rifle. The distances we're talking about, well, it takes years to develop that kind of precision." Sarah appreciated his concern, but it was too late to back down now. Half the town had driven out to watch, including Buck Morrison, who was holding court near the equipment tent, regaling anyone who would listen with predictions about the morning's entertainment. The competition format was straightforward. Each shooter would fire 5 rounds at targets placed at 100 yards, then 200 yards, and finally 300 yards. Points were awarded based on accuracy, with the tightest groupings earning the highest scores. It was a test of pure marksmanship. No fancy equipment, no special conditions, just skill, patience, and steady hands. As Sarah looked around at her competition, she noticed something that made her stomach sink even further. These weren't just casual weekend shooters. Many carried custom rifles in expensive cases, wore shooting jackets covered in patches from various competitions, and moved with the confidence that comes from years of experience.
The equipment assignment process was supposed to be random, ensuring fairness among competitors who didn't bring their own rifles. Jim Patterson had prepared 10 identical rifles for the competition, well-maintained Remington 700s that had served the event faithfully for years. Each rifle had been cleaned, calibrated, and test-fired the week before to ensure consistent performance. Sarah watched nervously as the other competitors drew numbers from a hat, each corresponding to a specific rifle. The weapons were laid out on a long table, each tagged with its number and accompanied by a small supply of ammunition. The experienced shooters examined their assigned rifles with the practiced eye of people who understood the subtle differences that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. When Sarah's turn came, she drew number 7. As she approached the table to claim her rifle, she noticed Buck Morrison and several of his friends huddled together, whispering and glancing in her direction. Their expressions suggested they knew something she didn't, and that something was likely not in her favor. "Number 7, announced Tim Bradley, Buck's closest friend and the unofficial leader of what locals called the Murphy's Tavern Crew. Well, that's interesting." Sarah picked up the rifle, immediately noticing it felt different from the one her uncle had let her handle during practice. The stock was scratched and worn, the metal showed signs of age, and something about the balance seemed off. But what did she know? This was only the second rifle she had ever held. "That's the old girl," chuckled another competitor, a man named Dale, who worked at the local auto shop. "Been hoping someone would draw that number." "Why?" she asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. "Oh, that rifle's got character," Buck said, his grin widening. "Been part of this competition for years. Some people say it's cursed, others say it's just particular about who shoots it." Jim Patterson overheard the exchange and walked over, concern evident on his weathered face. "Now hold on, boys. That rifle was tested just like all the others. It shoots fine." "Sure it does," Dale agreed, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Just ask Billy Henderson about his experience with it last year, or Mike Torres the year before that." Sarah was beginning to understand that she had been set up. The random draw had been anything but random, and rifle number 7 was apparently the equivalent of drawing the short straw. The whispered conversations, the knowing looks, the poorly concealed amusement, it all made sense now. "What's wrong with it?" she asked directly, tired of the games and innuendo. Buck shrugged with exaggerated innocence. "Nothing's wrong with it technically. It just has a reputation for being unpredictable. Shoots a little high, pulls to the left, groupings are inconsistent, personality traits." The other competitors were now openly watching the exchange, some with sympathy, others with barely concealed amusement. Sarah realized this was part of the show they'd come to see, the city girl getting pranked with the notorious problem rifle. But Jim Patterson wasn't having it. "Sarah, if you'd prefer, I can—" "No," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with a firmness in her voice. "I'll use this one." She had come this far, endured weeks of preparation and anxiety, and absorbed the skeptical looks and whispered comments. She wasn't going to give these men the satisfaction of seeing her back down over equipment issues. If they wanted to stack the deck against her, so be it. "Atta girl," Buck said, clapping slowly. "I respect that. Takes guts to stick with a losing hand." Sarah spent the next few minutes familiarizing herself with the rifle, working the bull to action, checking the scope, and getting a feel for its weight and balance. The more she handled it, the more she noticed subtle issues that could affect accuracy. The trigger had an unusually long pull, the scope seemed loose in its mounts, and there was a slight wobble in the stock that suggested internal problems. Around her, the other competitors were going through their own preparation routines. Some were making minute adjustments to their scopes, others were checking wind conditions and calculating adjustments. A few of the more experienced shooters were already lying prone on the shooting mats, getting comfortable in their shooting positions. The target range stretched out before them, marked at precise intervals. At 100 yards, the targets looked reasonably large, but Sarah knew that at 300 yards, they would appear no bigger than postage stamps. The thought of hitting such a distant target with a rifle that apparently had accuracy issues made her question every decision that had led to this moment. First relay, prepare for 100-yard targets. Shooters, take your positions, Jim announced through a bull hand. Sarah found herself assigned to lane 12 between two experienced competitors who moved with practiced efficiency. To her left was Marcus Webb, a retired military sniper who had won this competition 3 of the last 5 years. To her right was young Tommy Patterson, Jim's nephew, who had been shooting competitively since he was 12 years old. As she lowered herself onto the shooting mat, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching her every move. She had practiced the prone shooting position with her uncle, but this was different. The ground was harder, the angle felt wrong, and the rifle seemed to fight her attempts to find a stable position. Marcus Webb glanced over and offered quietly, "Keep your breathing steady and don't overthink it." It was the first genuine piece of advice she had received all morning, and she was grateful for it.
The 100-yard targets stood like silent sentinels in the distance, their black bullseyes centered on bright white paper squares. From Sarah's position on the shooting mat, they seemed both impossibly small and tantalizingly achievable. She had practiced visualization exercises during her 3 weeks of preparation, imagining herself in exactly this position, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. The weight of the notorious rifle number 7 pressed against her shoulder as she struggled to find a comfortable shooting position. Every movement seemed amplified. Every adjustment felt clumsy and obvious. Around her, the experienced shooters had settled into their positions with the fluid grace of people who had done this thousands of times. Relay 1, you have 5 minutes for sighting shots, Jim Patterson announced. After that, we begin the scored round. Sarah knew that sighting shots were crucial. They allowed shooters to make final adjustments to their scopes and get a feel for how their rifle was performing under current conditions. Wind, temperature, humidity, and even barometric pressure could affect bullet trajectory, and experienced competitors used these practice shots to compensate for such variables. She lined up the crosshairs on the target, trying to remember everything her uncle had taught her about breathing and trigger control. The scope's image wavered slightly as she fought to keep the rifle steady, and she could feel her heart rate accelerating with nervous energy. Her first sighting shot cracked across the range, and Sarah immediately knew something was wrong. Instead of the solid thump that should have indicated a hit on the target, there was only silence. She looked through the scope, searching for the telltale hole that would show where her bullet had struck. "Spotter says you're off the paper entirely," called out Dave Martinez, the range safety officer who was monitoring the targets through high-powered binoculars. "Looks like you're shooting high and to the right." A ripple of chuckles ran through the spectator area, where Buck Morrison and his friends were positioned with folding chairs and coolers of beer, settling in to enjoy the show. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to focus on the task at hand. She made what she hoped were appropriate adjustments to the scope, cranking the elevation down and the windage to the left. The mechanisms felt loose and imprecise, confirming her suspicions about the rifle's condition. This wasn't just about her inexperience. There were legitimate equipment issues that would challenge even a skilled marksman. Her second sighting shot at least hit the paper, though it struck well outside the scoring rings. The hole appeared in the bottom left corner of the target, indicating she had overcorrected her adjustments. She was beginning to understand why rifle number 7 had earned its reputation. "Better," Marcus Webb whispered from the adjacent lane. "You're learning the rifle's personality." By her third sighting shot, Sarah had managed to hit within the outer scoring rings, though still far from the bullseye. It wasn't pretty, but it was progress.
More importantly, she was starting to develop a feel for the rifle's quirks. The trigger broke inconsistently, sometimes crisp, sometimes with a long, creepy pull. The scope tracked reasonably well, but seemed to have a mind of its own when it came to returning to 0 after adjustments. "Sighting time complete," Jim announced. "Prepare for the first scored relay. 5 shots, 100 yards. Shooters ready?" Sarah chambered her first competition round, the metallic sound of the bolt action echoing in the sudden quiet. Around her, 20 other competitors were going through the same ritual, but the atmosphere had shifted from casual preparation to focused intensity. She settled into her shooting position, trying to control her breathing and steady her racing pulse. The crosshairs danced across the target as she fought to maintain a consistent sight picture. Every piece of advice she had absorbed over the past 3 weeks seemed to evaporate under the pressure of the moment. Her first scored shot felt different from the practice rounds. The trigger break was cleaner, the recoil more manageable, and something in her technique clicked into place. Through the scope, she could see a hole appear in the target, not in the bullseye, but within the scoring rings. "On target," Dave Martinez called out, and Sarah felt a surge of relief and confidence. Her second shot was even better, striking closer to the center of the target. The rifle was still fighting her, still displaying the unpredictable characteristics that had earned it notoriety, but she was learning to work with its peculiarities rather than against them. By her third shot, something remarkable was happening. The murmurs from the spectator area had quieted, and several of the more experienced competitors were glancing in her direction between their own shots. Sarah wasn't just hitting the target, she was grouping her shots with increasing consistency. Her fourth shot struck within inches of the previous 2, creating a cluster that would have been respectable for any shooter, let alone a complete novice using a problematic rifle. As she prepared for her 5th and final shot at 100 yards, Sarah realized something had changed in her approach to the rifle. Instead of fighting its tendencies, she had begun to anticipate them. The loose trigger didn't surprise her anymore. The scoop's quirky tracking had become predictable. She was developing an intuitive understanding of the weapon that transcended technical knowledge. Her final shot was the best of the series, striking just outside the bullseye and completing a group that measured less than 3 inches across. For a first-time competitor, using a rifle with a reputation for inaccuracy, it was an impressive performance that had caught everyone's attention. "Well, I'll be damned," I heard someone mutter from the spectator area. But this was just the beginning. The 200-yard targets were waiting, and if the 100-yard performance had surprised people, Sarah was about to discover that she and rifle number 7 were just getting started.
The transition from 100 to 200 yards marked more than just a change in distance. It represented a quantum leap in difficulty that separated casual shooters from serious marksmen. At 200 yards, environmental factors that were merely inconveniences at shorter ranges became significant variables that could mean the difference between a perfect shot and a complete miss. Sarah stood behind the firing line, stretching her back and rolling her shoulders to work out the tension that had built up during the first relay. Around her, the other competitors were engaged in their own preparation rituals. Some were making scope adjustments based on their 100-yard performance. Others were studying wind flags and trying to read the subtle air currents that could push a bullet off course over the longer distance. The morning sun had climbed higher, and with it came increasing heat shimmer that made the distant targets appear to dance and waver through the scopes. What had seemed like manageable challenges at 100 yards now looked dauntingly complex. "Not bad for a beginner," Marcus Webb said as he settled onto the mat beside her. "But 200 yards is where this competition really begins. Distance magnifies every mistake, every imperfection in technique." Sarah nodded, studying the distant targets that now appeared roughly half the size they had at the previous distance. Through her scope, the black bullseye looked like a small dot surrounded by scoring rings that seemed impossibly precise. She was beginning to understand why this competition had developed such a reputation for humbling even experienced shooters. The wind had picked up slightly, creating a gentle but consistent breeze from the southwest.
Sarah watched the range flags rippling in the air current and tried to remember her uncle's advice about reading wind conditions. A steady wind was actually easier to compensate for than gusting conditions, but at 200 yards, even small miscalculations could push a bullet several inches off target. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Rifle number 7 felt different as Sarah chambered the first round for the 200-yard relay. The weapon that had seemed clumsy and unpredictable during her initial handling now felt familiar, almost like an extension of herself. She had learned to work with its quirks, the long trigger pull that required steady pressure, the scope that tracked true but returned to zero with a slight bias, the stock that needed to be held just so to minimize vibration. Relay to 200 yards, prepare for sighting shots, Jim Patterson announced. Sarah's first sighting shot at the longer distance was a sobering reminder of how much the game had changed. What she thought was a well-aimed shot struck the target several inches low and to the right of where she had intended. The bullet trajectory that had seemed manageable at 100 yards now displayed a more pronounced arc, and the wind drift was more noticeable. She made scope adjustments, cranking up the elevation, and compensating for the wind. Her second sighting shot was closer, but still not where she wanted it. The rifle was teaching her patience. At this distance, rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes were magnified exponentially. By her third sighting shot, she was hitting closer to her point of aim, but she could tell that 200 yards demanded a different level of precision in every aspect of her technique. Her breathing had to be more controlled, her trigger squeeze more consistent, her body position more stable. The other competitors were experiencing their own challenges with the increased distance. Even Marcus Webb, with all his experience, fired several sighting shots before he seemed satisfied with his zero. Tommy Patterson was making frequent scope adjustments, and she could see frustration building in his posture as he struggled to find the right combination of settings. Sighting complete, prepare for scored shots. 5 rounds, 200 yards. As Sarah settled into position for her first scored shot, she realized that something fundamental had changed in her approach to shooting. The nervousness that had dominated her first relay had been replaced with focused concentration. The external pressure from the spectators, the jokes about the broken rifle, even the stakes of her bet with Buck Morrison, all of it had faded into background noise. Her first scored shot felt perfect from the moment she pressed the trigger. The rifle's recoil was absorbed smoothly, the scope settled back on target quickly, and through the optics, she could see a hole appear in the target very close to where she had aimed. "Good shot," Dave Martinez called out. "Looks like a 9." A 9 out of 10 at 200 yards with a rifle that supposedly couldn't group consistently was impressive by any standard. Sarah felt a surge of confidence as she prepared for her second shot, but she forced herself to maintain the same deliberate pace that had served her well. Her second shot was even better, a solid 10 that struck within the inner ring of the bullseye. She could hear surprised murmurs from the spectator area, and several of the other competitors glanced in her direction between their own shots. But it was her third shot that truly announced Sarah's presence in the competition. The bullet struck almost exactly where she had aimed, creating a hole so close to her second shot that they nearly touched. 2 shots, touching at 200 yards, with a rifle that was supposed to be unreliable? "What the hell?" she heard Buck Morrison mutter from the spectator area, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Sarah's fourth shot continued the pattern, landing within an inch of the previous 2 and creating a group that was drawing attention from shooters throughout the range. Even competitors who were focused on their own performance were stealing glances at lane 12, where the librarian with the broken rifle was making shots that would impress seasoned marksmen. Her final shot at 200 yards was the culmination of everything she had learned about rifle number 7 and about her own capabilities. She took her time, reading the wind, controlling her breathing, and applying steady pressure to the trigger. The shot broke cleanly, and she could see immediately through the scope that it had struck within the tight cluster she had established. "Damn," Marcus Webb said quietly. "That's about a 2-inch group at 200 yards, with that rifle." Sarah sat up from her shooting position, her heart racing with excitement and disbelief. She had just fired a group at 200 yards that would have been respectable with any rifle, using a weapon that everyone assumed was incapable of such accuracy.
More importantly, she was beginning to understand that the problem wasn't with rifle number 7, it's that no one had taken the time to truly learn its characteristics. The scores were posted on a large board visible to all competitors and spectators. After 2 relays, Sarah Mitchell, the first-time competitor from Clearwater's library, was sitting in 3rd place overall, ahead of veteran shooters with decades of experience. The 300-yard targets looked impossibly small in the distance, but Sarah was no longer intimidated. She and rifle number 7 had found their rhythm, and the longest shots were yet to come.
At 300 yards, the targets seemed to exist in another dimension entirely. Through the scope, they appeared as mere postage stamps against the backdrop of the range's dirt berm, their black bullseyes no larger than pencil erasers from Sarah's perspective. This was the distance where marksmanship became as much art as science, where the slightest imperfection in technique could send a bullet sailing wide of the mark. The morning had progressed into early afternoon, and with the changing conditions came new challenges. Heat shimmer rose from the ground in visible waves, creating optical distortions that made the distant targets appear to dance and waver. The wind had shifted slightly, now coming from the northwest at what Sarah estimated to be 5 to 7 miles per hour. Not strong enough to be obvious, but consistent enough to push bullets significantly off course over the extended distance. Sarah found herself in an almost surreal situation. After years of being known simply as the quiet librarian who organized book clubs and helped kids with homework, she was now the center of attention at a shooting competition. Word of her performance had spread beyond the immediate spectators, and people were arriving from nearby farms and towns to witness what many were calling either a remarkable beginner's luck or something approaching the impossible. Rifle number 7 lay across her lap as she sat behind the firing line, and she found herself studying the weapon with new appreciation. What she had initially perceived as defects were actually characteristics. Quirks that, once understood, could be compensated for and even utilized. The trigger's long pull, which had seemed inconsistent, actually broke at exactly the same point every time once she learned to feel for the subtle resistance change. The scope's tracking, while not perfect, was predictable in its imperfections. "I've been shooting this competition for 15 years, said Gail from the auto shop, who had wandered over during the break between relays. "Never seen anyone make friends with that rifle the way you have. Hell, I drew it 3 years ago and couldn't hit the broadside of a barn." The comment highlighted something Sarah was beginning to understand about shooting sports in general. Much of what people attributed to equipment problems was actually a mismatch between shooter and rifle. Every weapon had its own personality, its own requirements, and most shooters simply didn't have the patience or the fresh perspective necessary to adapt to something that didn't fit their preconceived notions. Marcus Webb had been watching her preparation with the interest of someone who recognized something unusual happening. You know, there's a reason some of the old-time military snipers insisted on keeping the same rifle throughout their entire careers. It's not just about the mechanical accuracy, it's about the relationship between shooter and weapon. As competitors began taking their positions for the 300-yard relay, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere had changed significantly from the morning's casual mockery. Buck Morrison and his friends were no longer making jokes. Instead, they were watching intently, their expressions mixing disbelief with something that might have been respect. Other spectators were studying her through binoculars, trying to understand what made this complete novice capable of outperforming seasoned competitors. The pressure should have been overwhelming, but Sarah found herself entering a state of focused calm that felt almost meditative. The external noise, the conversations, the wind, even her own doubts, seemed to fade away, leaving only the essential elements: the rifle, the target, and the space between them. "Relay 3, 300 yards. Prepare for sighting shots," Jim Patterson announced, his voice carrying a note of anticipation that hadn't been there during the earlier relays. Sarah's first sighting shot at 300 yards was a humbling reminder of just how much distance mattered in precision shooting. Even with her newfound understanding of rifle number 7's characteristics, the shot struck several inches low and left of her intended point of impact. At this distance, factors that were barely noticeable at shorter ranges became dominant variables in the equation. She made scope adjustments, but more cautiously than before. At 300 yards,
Overcorrection could be as problematic as undercorrection. The bullet's trajectory followed a more pronounced arc over the extended distance, and wind drift became a major factor in shot placement. She found herself studying the range flags more intently, trying to read not just the wind's speed, but its consistency and direction changes. Her second sighting shot was closer, but still not where she wanted it. The rifle was still teaching her, still revealing new aspects of its personality at this extreme range. She realized that at 300 yards, rifle number 7 demanded even more precise technique. Her breathing had to be perfectly controlled, her trigger squeeze absolutely consistent, her body position rock solid. By her third sighting shot, she was hitting within the scoring rings, and she began to understand that 300-yard shooting was as much about patience and observation as it was about mechanical skill. Each shot was providing data about how the rifle behaved under current conditions, and she was learning to process that information and make appropriate adjustments. Sighting complete. Final relay, 5 shots for score at 300 yards. The finality of that announcement wasn't lost on anyone present. This was where the competition would be decided, where the pretenders would be separated from the genuine marksmen. Sarah had surprised everyone, including herself, but 300 yards was where marksmanship legends were made or broken. As she settled into her shooting position for what might be the most important shots of her life, Sarah realized that her relationship with rifle number 7 had evolved beyond simple familiarity. She understood its moods, its preferences, its requirements. More than that, she trusted it to deliver her bullets precisely where she aimed, provided she did her part correctly. Her first scored shot at 300 yards felt different from anything she had experienced before. The entire process, the breathing, the sight alignment, the trigger press, the follow-through, flowed together as a single, fluid motion. The rifle's recoil was absorbed perfectly, the scope settled back on target immediately, and she could see through the optics that her bullet had struck very close to the center of the target. 10! Dave Martinez called out, and the range went quiet.
The silence that followed Dave Martinez's call of 10 was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her quiet life as a librarian. It was the kind of silence that occurs when something extraordinary is unfolding, when people witness an event that challenges their understanding of what's possible. A perfect 10 at 300 yards with rifle number 7, the notorious problem child of the competition, was not supposed to happen. Sarah remained in her shooting position, looking through the scope at the distant target where her bullet had just struck. The hole was clearly visible in the center ring, a testament to everything she had learned about the rifle's characteristics over the course of the morning. But more than that, it represented a fundamental shift in her understanding of her own capabilities. Around her, the other competitors continued with their own shots, but she could sense their divided attention. Marcus Webb fired his shot with his usual precision, but she noticed him glance in her direction immediately afterward. Tommy Patterson seemed to be struggling with concentration, his usual fluid rhythm disrupted by the unfolding drama in lane 12. As Sarah prepared for her second shot at 300 yards, she forced herself to block out the external pressure and focus solely on the task at hand. The target seemed impossibly small through the scope, the black bullseye no larger than a quarter held at arm's length. Heat shimmer continued to rise from the ground, creating optical illusions that could easily fool the eye. The wind remained steady but subtle, requiring constant attention to the range flags. She had learned from her first scored shot about how rifle number 7 behaved at this extreme distance. The trajectory drop was more pronounced than her calculations had suggested, and the wind drift was slightly greater than she had compensated for. But now she had real data, actual performance information that allowed her to make precise adjustments. Her second shot process was deliberate and methodical. She controlled her breathing, allowing her natural respiratory pause to create the perfect moment for trigger release. The crosshairs settled onto the target with less wavering than she had experienced in earlier relays. Her body had adapted to the shooting position. Her muscles had learned to support the rifle's weight without tremor. The trigger broke cleanly, exactly where she expected it to, and the rifle's recoil felt perfectly managed. Through the scope, she watched as another hole appeared in the target, this one so close to her first shot that they nearly touched.
10, Martinez called again, his voice carrying a note of amazement. That's 2 10s, and they're touching! The murmur that rippled through the spectator area was audible even from Sarah's position on the firing line. 2 touching 10s at 300 yards would have been impressive for any shooter. From a complete novice using a supposedly problematic rifle, it was approaching the realm of the impossible. Buck Morrison's voice carried clearly in the afternoon air. This ain't right. Nobody shoots like that with that rifle. But Sarah was no longer paying attention to the commentary or the growing crowd of spectators. She had entered a state of concentration that felt almost transcendent, where the external world had narrowed to encompass only the essential elements of marksmanship. Time seemed to slow down, allowing her to process every detail of the shooting process with crystalline clarity. Her third shot preparation was interrupted by a momentary wind shift that she detected by watching the flags downrange. Instead of rushing the shot, she waited, observing the air currents until they returned to the consistent pattern she had been reading. Patience at 300 yards was more than a virtue. It was a necessity. When conditions stabilized, she resumed her shooting sequence. The rifle had become an extension of her will, responding to her intentions with precision that seemed to transcend its mechanical limitations. Every aspect of her technique had refined itself through repetition and feedback, creating a shooting system that was approaching optimal efficiency. Her third shot felt perfect from the moment the trigger broke. The bullet's flight seemed to follow an invisible thread connecting her rifle to the target's center, and she could see immediately through the scope that it had struck within the growing cluster of holes she had established. 10, Martinez announced, his professional composure beginning to crack with excitement. 3 10s, and the group is measuring less than an inch! An inch group at 300 yards was remarkable shooting by any standard. World-class competitors considered such groupings to be exceptional performances, the kind of shooting that won championships and set records. That Sarah was accomplishing this with rifle number 7 was beyond remarkable. It was redefining what people believed possible. The other competitors had essentially stopped paying attention to their own performances, openly watching the drama unfolding in lane 12. Marcus Webb had finished his 5 shots, but remained on his mat, studying Sarah's technique with the fascination of a professional who recognized mastery when he saw it. Tommy Patterson had actually paused mid-shot sequence, lowering his rifle to watch Sarah's preparation for her 4th shot. Even Jim Patterson, who was supposed to be maintaining order and overseeing the competition, found himself holding his breath as Sarah settled into position. The pressure of the moment should have been crushing. Sarah was aware that dozens of people were watching her every move, that her performance was being dissected and analyzed by experienced shooters who couldn't explain what they were witnessing. She knew that her 4th shot could either continue the impossible streak or prove that her first 3 shots had been the result of extraordinary luck. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, Sarah experienced a profound sense of calm. She had moved beyond conscious technique into a realm where her body and mind worked together without deliberate thought. The rifle felt weightless in her hands. The target seemed larger and clearer than it had any right to be at 300 yards, and time itself appeared to slow down. Her 4th shot was the culmination of everything she had learned about precision marksmanship in a single morning. The breathing, the sight picture, the trigger control, the follow-through. Every element flowed together in perfect harmony. The shot broke with mechanical precision, and she could see through the scope that her bullet had found its mark within the impossibly tight cluster she had established. 10, Martinez called again, his voice now carrying genuine awe. 4 10s, a group size approximately 3/4 of an inch. The spectator area erupted in astonished conversation. People who had come to watch a local shooting competition were witnessing something that bordered on the impossible. Buck Morrison stood silent, his earlier skepticism replaced by stunned disbelief. Dale from the auto shop was shaking his head repeatedly, muttering that he had to see it to believe it. Sarah had 1 shot remaining. One final opportunity to complete what would be remembered as either the greatest shooting performance in the competition's history or a near miss that would still be talked about for years to come. The mathematical precision required for 5 shots to group within a single hole at 300 yards was staggering. The kind of accuracy that challenged the physical limits of both the rifle and ammunition.
The weight of expectation hung in the air like the heat shimmer rising from the distant target. Sarah Mitchell, the quiet librarian who had arrived that morning as the butt of a cruel joke, now held the attention of every person present. 4 perfect 10s at 300 yards, grouped in less than an inch, with a rifle that everyone had written off as hopelessly inaccurate. One more shot, just one, stood between her and a performance that would redefine what people believed possible. Sarah remained in her shooting position, but she could feel the collective breath of the spectators being held. The range, which had been filled with the typical sounds of a competition, bolt actions cycling, brass hitting the ground, quiet conversations between shots, had fallen into an almost reverent silence. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen next. She studied the distant target through her scope, examining the tight cluster of holes that marked her first 4 shots. They formed a pattern so precise it looked almost artificial, as if someone had carefully measured and drilled them with mechanical precision rather than achieving them through marksmanship. The center of the target was becoming a single, enlarged hole where multiple bullets had passed through nearly identical trajectories. Rifle number 7 rested against her shoulder with familiar weight. Over the course of the morning, the weapon had transformed from an unfamiliar burden into something that felt like an extension of her own body. She understood its quirks completely now, the trigger that required exactly 3.2 pounds of pressure and broke cleanly if approached correctly, the scope that tracked true but required a specific hold to maintain 0, the stock that needed to be positioned just so to eliminate vibration. "Take your time," Marcus Webb whispered from the adjacent lane. "There's no clock on perfection." His words carried the weight of professional experience and genuine respect. Marcus had seen combat in 3 different conflicts, had made shots under pressure that meant the difference between life and death, and had won more shooting competitions than most people enter in a lifetime. His validation meant more to Sarah than all the amazed murmurs from the spectator gallery. As Sarah prepared for her 5th and final shot, she realized that this moment represented more than just the conclusion of a shooting competition. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun with a foolish bet in a tavern, but had evolved into something much more profound. She had discovered capabilities within herself that she never knew existed, had proven that assumptions about gender, experience, and natural ability could be shattered by determination and focus. The target seemed to pulse slightly in her scope, the black bullseye expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the heat shimmer. At 300 yards, optical illusions were constant companions, and separating reality from distortion required both experience and intuition. Sarah had learned to read these conditions over the course of the morning, developing an almost supernatural ability to see through the atmospheric interference. She began her final shooting sequence with the methodical precision that had served her throughout the competition. Her breathing slowed to a controlled rhythm that would create the perfect natural respiratory pause. Her body settled into the shooting position with unconscious competence, every muscle group supporting the rifle without unnecessary tension. The crosshairs found the target center with less movement than she had experienced all day. Whether it was the result of improved technique, increased confidence, or simply the natural progression of her learning curve, the rifle felt steadier in her hands than it ever had before. The sight picture was crystalline clear, the target appearing larger and more defined than physics should have allowed at such distance. Buck Morrison's voice carried from the spectator area, barely higher than a whisper but audible in the profound quiet. "If she makes this shot, I'll—" He never finished the sentence, as if speaking might somehow jinx the moment or interrupt the delicate concentration required for what everyone knew was about to be attempted. Sarah's finger found the trigger with the familiarity of countless repetitions. The pressure built gradually, smoothly, with none of the jerky motion that had characterized her early attempts. She could feel the mechanical resistance that preceded the breakpoint, could sense the exact moment that the trigger would release the firing pin. Time seemed to dilate as she approached the critical moment.
The morning's journey flashed through her consciousness: the nervous registration, the revelation about rifle number 7's reputation, the gradual building of confidence and competence, the growing amazement of spectators and competitors alike. It all had led to this single moment, this final shot that would determine whether her performance would be remembered as remarkable or legendary. The trigger broke with perfect mechanical precision, exactly where she expected it to. The rifle's recoil was absorbed flawlessly by her shooting position, the scope settled back on target with minimal movement, and, through the optics, she could see her bullet's impact point immediately. The hole appeared in the center of the target, not alongside her previous 4 shots, but directly through the enlarged opening they had created. 5 shots, fired at 300 yards with a rifle that supposedly couldn't group consistently, had passed through virtually identical trajectories to create what appeared to be a single, large hole in the target. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Dave Martinez had his spotting scope trained on the target, confirming what everyone could see but few could believe. Jim Patterson was already walking toward the target to verify the grouping measurement. The other competitors sat motionless on their shooting mats, witnessing a performance that would become legend. 5 10s, Martinez finally announced, his voice carrying across the range with the solemnity of a historical pronouncement. Group measurement, he paused, double-checking his spotting scope. Group measurement is approximately half an inch. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just witnessed a perfect group at 300 yards. The eruption of sound that followed was unlike anything the range had ever experienced.
The explosion of noise that followed Dave Martinez's announcement was immediate and overwhelming. 23 years of shooting competitions at this range had never produced anything approaching what had just occurred, and the spectators' reactions ranged from wild cheering to stunned disbelief. Some people were applauding, others were shaking their heads in amazement, and a few were examining their own binoculars as if the equipment might explain what they had witnessed. Sarah remained in her shooting position for several moments, not quite ready to believe what had happened. Through her scope, she could see the target that now bore the evidence of her impossible achievement. 5 shots that had grouped so tightly at 300 yards that they appeared to be a single, enlarged hole. The precision required for such a performance was staggering, the kind of accuracy that occurred perhaps once in a generation, even among world-class competitors. When she finally sat up from the shooting mat, the first thing she noticed was the expression on Marcus Webb's face. The veteran sniper, who had seen remarkable shooting under the most challenging conditions imaginable, was looking at her with something approaching awe. His professional composure had been completely shattered by what he had just witnessed. "In 30 years of shooting," Marcus said quietly, "I have never seen anything like that. Not in competition, not in combat, not on the best day with the most perfect conditions. What you just did—" He paused, searching for words. "What you just did shouldn't be possible." Around the range, other competitors were abandoning their own shooting to examine the target that was already becoming legendary. Jim Patterson had reached the 300-yard line and was using a precision measuring device to confirm the group size. Even from a distance, his body language conveyed amazement as he documented measurements that would be talked about for decades. Tommy Patterson, Jim's nephew, who had been shooting competitively since childhood, approached Sarah with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. "Ma'am, I've been trying to shoot a group that tight for 10 years, with custom rifles, hand-loaded ammunition, perfect conditions. How did you—" He gestured helplessly toward the distant target. The question that Tommy couldn't finish was echoing in everyone's mind. How had a complete novice, using a rifle with a reputation for inaccuracy, achieved a level of precision that eluded seasoned marksmen with decades of experience and thousands of dollars in specialized equipment? Buck Morrison had gone completely silent, his earlier jokes and skeptical comments replaced by an expression of stunned confusion. The bet that had started as a way to prove a point about traditional gender roles had backfired spectacularly. Not only had Sarah hit the targets consistently, she had delivered a shooting performance that would be remembered long after everyone present had forgotten why she was there in the first place.
Dale from the auto shop was examining rifle number 7 with new interest, handling it as if it might reveal some hidden secret that could explain the morning's events. "This is the same rifle that couldn't hit the broadside of a barn when I used it," he muttered, working the bolt action and peering down the barrel. "Same trigger, same scope, same everything." The growing crowd of spectators was now including people who had heard about the extraordinary shooting and driven from miles away to witness the aftermath. News traveled fast in rural communities, and word of the librarian's impossible achievement was spreading through the county like wildfire. Local newspaper reporters were already making phone calls, and someone had mentioned that video footage of the final shots might make its way to social media. Sarah found herself at the center of a growing circle of admirers and curiosity seekers, all wanting to understand how such a performance was possible. The attention was overwhelming for someone accustomed to the quiet solitude of library work, but she was beginning to recognize that what had happened transcended simple marksmanship achievement. "The rifle wasn't broken," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that fell over the crowd. "It was just misunderstood." The statement seemed to encapsulate something profound about the morning's events. Rifle number 7 hadn't been defective, it had simply required a different approach, a willingness to work with its characteristics rather than against them. Sarah's complete lack of preconceived notions about how the rifle should behave allowed her to discover its true potential. Jim Patterson returned from the target line with official measurements and an expression that mixed professional pride with personal amazement. The man who had organized this competition for over 2 decades was about to announce results that would rewrite the event's record books. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the range with formal authority, "after careful measurement and verification, I can confirm that Sarah Mitchell has achieved a 5-shot group measuring 0.487 inches at 300 yards. This represents not only a new competition record, but the finest grouping ever recorded at this range under any circumstances." The applause that followed was thunderous and sustained. Even competitors who had been defeated by Sarah's extraordinary performance joined in the ovation, recognizing that they had witnessed something truly special. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about being present for a moment that would become part of shooting sports folklore. But the most significant moment came when Buck Morrison stepped forward from the crowd. The man who had started the entire chain of events with his casual sexism and dismissive attitude now faced the reality that his assumptions had not just been wrong, but spectacularly wrong. His approach towards Sarah was watched by everyone present, and the range fell silent again as people waited to see how he would respond to being so thoroughly proven wrong.
Buck Morrison's walk across the range toward Sarah felt like it took an eternity, though it lasted only seconds. Every eye followed his progress, every ear strained to hear what the man who had initiated this extraordinary chain of events would say to the woman who had so completely shattered his assumptions about gender and ability. When he reached Sarah, Buck removed his weathered baseball cap, a gesture of respect that everyone recognized as significant. For a man known for his stubborn pride and traditional views, the action represented a fundamental shift in perspective that went far beyond simple acknowledgement of defeat. "Miss Mitchell," he began, his voice carrying across the silent range, "I owe you an apology that's bigger than anything words can express. What you did here today—" He paused, looking toward the distant target that bore evidence of her impossible achievement. "Well, it's humbled me in ways I didn't know I needed." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't the grudging admission of someone who had lost a bet, but the genuine recognition from someone whose fundamental beliefs had been challenged and changed by undeniable evidence. "You didn't just win our bet," Buck continued. "You've taught an old fool that talent and determination don't come with gender requirements attached. I've been shooting for 40 years, and I've never come close to what you accomplished with that rifle that I thought was worthless." Sarah accepted his extended hand with grace that impressed everyone watching. "The rifle wasn't worthless, Buck. It just needed someone willing to listen to what it was trying to say."
Her response revealed something profound about her approach to the morning's challenge. While others had seen rifle number 7 as a problem to be overcome, Sarah had treated it as a puzzle to be solved. The difference in perspective had made all the difference in outcome. The formal award ceremony that followed was unlike any in the competition's history. Jim Patterson presented Sarah with the winner's trophy, a modest piece of metalwork that suddenly seemed inadequate to commemorate such an extraordinary achievement. Local photographer Janet Williams documented every moment, understanding that these images would become historical records of something truly special. But the most meaningful recognition came from her fellow competitors. Marcus Webb presented her with a patch from his old military unit, an honor typically reserved for soldiers who had proven themselves under fire. "You've got the instincts of a natural-born marksman," he told her. "What you did today would impress shooters in any military unit in the world." Tommy Patterson, representing the younger generation of competitive shooters, offered her his personal business card for a custom rifle manufacturer. "When you're ready to move beyond borrowed equipment," he said with genuine respect, "these folks build rifles that would be worthy of your abilities." Even Dale from the auto shop had a gift, a hand-tooled leather rifle sling that his grandfather had made decades earlier. "I was saving this for when I finally learned to shoot worth a damn," he said with self-deprecating humor. "Figured it would find better use with someone who actually knows what they're doing." The local newspaper reporter who had arrived to cover what she expected to be a routine community event found herself documenting a story that would spread far beyond the county boundaries. Sarah's achievement was the kind of human interest story that resonated with people everywhere, the quiet underdog who shocked the world through determination and natural ability. As the crowd began to disperse and equipment was packed away, Sarah found herself alone with rifle number 7 for the first time since the morning's excitement began. She examined the weapon that had been the instrument of her triumph, running her hands along the worn stock that had felt so unfamiliar just hours earlier. The rifle looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same scratches, the same worn finish, the same supposedly problematic characteristics that had earned it a reputation as the competition's difficult child. But Sarah now understood that the problem had never been with the rifle itself. The issue was that no one had taken the time to understand its unique personality and work with its characteristics, rather than against them. Her Uncle Pete arrived just as the official ceremony concluded, having driven over as soon as he heard about her remarkable performance. His expression mixed pride, amazement, and a touch of humor at the situation his basic firearms instruction had helped create. "He taught you gun safety and basic shooting. Now he was doing miracles. He never taught you how to perform miracles." She laughed, the first genuinely relaxed moment she had experienced since the morning began. Maybe miracles happen when you stop fighting what you're working with and start listening to what it needs. The philosophical implications of her statement weren't lost on the people who heard it. Sarah's achievement represented more than just exceptional marksmanship. It demonstrated the power of approaching challenges with fresh perspective, without the burden of preconceived limitations. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Sarah realized that her life had changed fundamentally in the space of a single morning. She had arrived as a librarian who had never fired a rifle, and she was leaving as someone who had achieved one of the most remarkable shooting performances in the sport's history. But more than that, she had proven to herself and everyone else that extraordinary things were possible when determination met opportunity, regardless of background, experience, or what others considered realistic expectations.
The drive back to Clearwater was surreal, with the winner's trophy sitting on the passenger seat beside her, and rifle number 7 secured in the back of her uncle's truck. Sarah found herself replaying the morning's events, but they felt like memories of someone else's life. The quiet librarian who had left town that morning in nervous anticipation bore little resemblance to the woman returning as a shooting sports legend. Word of her achievement had spread faster than she could have imagined.
Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls and text messages from friends, family members, and people she barely knew. The local radio station had already broadcast a brief story about the competition results, and Janet Williams from the newspaper had mentioned that her photos were generating interest from regional media outlets. But perhaps the most significant call came from Marcus Webb, who had taken the time to research shooting sports records before contacting her. "Sarah," his voice carried excitement mixed with professional respect. "What you accomplished today isn't just a local competition record. That grouping size at 300 yards would be competitive in national championship events. You need to understand, you might have natural talent that occurs maybe once in a generation." The implications of his statement were staggering. Sarah had entered the competition simply to honor a foolish bet, never imagining that her performance might have significance beyond proving a point to Buck Morrison and his friends. The possibility that she possessed world-class natural ability in a sport she had never tried was both thrilling and overwhelming. By the time she reached Clearwater, a small crowd had gathered at Murphy's Tavern, where news of her victory had preceded her arrival. The same establishment where Buck's dismissive comments had triggered the entire adventure was now buzzing with excitement and pride in their local hero's achievement. Buck Morrison himself was holding court at the bar, but his tone had changed completely from 3 weeks earlier. Instead of making dismissive comments about women's capabilities, he was enthusiastically telling anyone who would listen about Sarah's extraordinary performance, taking partial credit for creating the circumstances that revealed her talent. $500 to the library, he announced loudly as Sarah entered the tavern. And that's just the beginning. Sarah Mitchell has put Clearwater on the map, and we owe her more than money can express. The crowd's response was warm and genuine, but Sarah found herself feeling somewhat disconnected from the celebration. The morning's experience had been intensely personal, a journey of self-discovery that transcended simple competition or community pride. She had learned things about focus, determination, and her own capabilities that would influence far more than her marksmanship abilities. Later that evening, in the quiet of her small apartment above the library, Sarah found herself examining the trophy and considering what came next. Marcus Webb's words about national-level competition kept echoing in her mind, along with Tommy Patterson's offer to connect her with custom rifle manufacturers, and Dale's gift of his grandfather's sling. The shooting sports community, she was learning, was unlike anything she had encountered in her academic world. It was a meritocracy where performance mattered more than background, where a librarian could earn the respect of military veterans and professional competitors simply by demonstrating skill and dedication. Her phone rang, interrupting her contemplation. The caller identification showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. Jim Patterson, the competition organizer. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me calling so late, but I've been fielding inquiries about you all afternoon. Word of your performance has reached some pretty significant people in the shooting sports world. There's a sponsor interested in supporting your development as a competitive shooter, and I've had calls from 3 different shooting academies asking about your availability for advanced training." The opportunities Jim described seemed to exist in a parallel universe to her quiet life organizing book clubs and helping students with research projects. Yet the morning's experience had proven that her assumptions about her own limitations might be as inaccurate as everyone else's assumptions about rifle number 7. "I need some time to think about all this," she told Jim, though she could already feel herself being drawn toward possibilities she had never imagined. "Of course," Jim replied. "But Sarah, don't let this opportunity pass by. What you demonstrated today is a gift that shouldn't be wasted. The shooting sports world needs people like you, people who can show that excellence comes from unexpected places." After ending the call, Sarah walked to her window overlooking Clearwater's quiet Main Street. The town looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but her relationship to it had changed fundamentally. She was no longer just the librarian, she was the woman who had achieved the impossible with a broken rifle and fresh perspective. The decision about her future wouldn't be made tonight, But she already knew that rifle number 7 had given her more than just a competition victory. It had shown her that the most profound limitations were often self-imposed, that extraordinary achievements were possible when determination meant opportunity. 3 weeks ago, she had defended women's capabilities in a theoretical debate. Today, she had proven those capabilities through undeniable performance. Tomorrow, she would begin exploring just how far those capabilities might take her. The quiet librarian had discovered that she was also a marksman, whose potential was limited only by her willingness to pursue it. Rifle number 7, the supposedly broken weapon that no one wanted, had become the instrument of her transformation from overlooked to extraordinary. As she prepared for bed, Sarah realized that the morning's lesson extended far beyond shooting sports. Sometimes the things that others dismiss as broken, difficult, or worthless are simply waiting for someone with the patience and fresh perspective necessary to unlock their true potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.